and welcome to GH MixMixx. In the first part of the show, we'll have an interview with an old friend of the show, Dr. John Osae Kwapong, a citadel of knowledge to whom we run every time we have an important discussion like what we have today to have. Today, we are going to look at what obviously everybody is talking about in Ghana. Ghana going to the IMF. About 6 or so, 7 years roughly ago, I had an interview with Dr. Mahamudu Bawumia, who is currently the Vice President and who has been touted generally as an economic whiz-kid. Currently, we are seeing on social media several videos of members of this current government, while they were in opposition, swearing they would never go to the IMF. Now, here we are indeed going to the IMF. Dr. John Osae Kwapong, first of all, welcome to your show, Doctor.
Thank you for having me once again.
Thank you so much for responding to us at such short notice.
No problem.
So, first of all, I'm trying to get this done in a fashion that everybody, as much as possible, will understand what this is all about. To do that, I'm going to start by asking you, is the IMF the wizard, the obeifo, the bad spirit that we've been made to believe by politicians?
So the IMF helps, right? They can be of help. It is set up in such a way that when countries run into fiscal problems, balance of payment problems, essentially when countries run into money problems, that you can treat it as one of their lenders of last resort, right? That especially because they are also members of the fund, that they can turn to it to say, look, we are facing some short-term challenges, and we really could use some help in getting through a difficult period, maybe a year, 2 years. Most of their programs, from what I've researched, is no more than 4 or 5 years. And so, if you look at Ghana's history of, turning to the IMF for various kinds of bailouts and support, that temporary relief that we've needed over a specific period of time, whether it was a 2-3 year program, that within those 2-3 years, whatever we promised to do in exchange for what the IMF gave us, that we were able to provide some economic stability and begin to see some gains around that. So, it doesn't solve everything, but at least the temporary relief that you need over a 2 to 3 year period, it gives that to you.
So, Doc, in the markets of KJTIA and Makola and Kotokraba and Okaishi, etc., right now, people are hearing that, Ghana is going to the IMF. What it means means a variety of things to a variety of people.
Right.
I don't know if I am, over flogging this horse, but what exactly is the IMF going to give us? Is the IMF going to give us actual physical loans that Ghana will have access to develop our, to pump in our economy in return for those policies that we all fear so much?
Right. So if you look at most of the bailouts that we've gone for, it involves some injection of money into the economy, right? So maybe they would say, we'll be able to lend you $900 and something million over 3 years. And so year one, they give you a certain percentage of it, and when you meet some benchmarks, they will give you a certain percentage of it, and then when you meet final benchmarks, they give you a certain percentage of it as well. So in terms of what it actually means for the ordinary man and the everyday, for the ordinary person and the everyday person on the street, it depends on also what we agree to do in exchange for getting the bailout, right?
We don't know.
So,
okay.
for example, if you look at how the exchange rate is behaving now, part of it is a demand and supply thing, right? So usually with this infusion, you would have enough dollars to shore up your foreign exchange reserve, which means that the demand for the dollar, there's enough supply to meet the demand for the dollar, right? Exchange rate goes down, it has a ripple effect on especially those who import things, and then those who go and retail those things to sell, on the ordinary market. So depending on how much we get and what we promise in exchange for that, it can have it does have ripple effects on different sectors of the economy. It just depends on exactly what we are asking for, how much we get, and where we feel we are going to prioritize that help that we're going to get in the short term.
Okay, we don't know that yet, so we'll wait till we know exactly what we're putting on the table, and then we can take a closer look at that. But considering everything that's been happening in the past couple years, with whether you're looking at it from the perspective of the opposition, i.e., it's government corruption that's basically the cause of this, or you are looking at it from the government's perspective, i.e., it's Russia and Ukraine and COVID, etc. Question is it a smart thing to do at this time, considering everything that's been happening, over the past few years?
If you look at all of the options that are available when you think about the challenges that you're facing, right? I can understand why the government at this point is saying to itself, look, we really have to turn to the IMF. And let me give you like a quick, so for example, if you think back to November 2021, when the Minister for Finance was presenting the fiscal year 2022 budget, right? Anybody who paid attention to that budget would have known immediately that there's a fiscal crisis looming because the projected revenue was 100 billion, but the projected expenditure was 137 billion, right? Which means that we were in the whole 37 billion just for fiscal year 2022. And mind you, this 37 billion deficit even included their projection of almost 7 billion in e-levy.
Exactly.
Right? So here we are, we've seen what has happened with e-levy. It took about almost like 6 months for it to get through Parliament. Its implementation is showing that people are voting with their feet, and so they are not really getting the expected revenue. The revenue that is coming in the first 2 months is way below expectation, and you're still facing that.
Let's sidetrack a little bit. Let's sidetrack a tad on that point, Doc. Isn't it a bit too early to determine that e-levy is not working? If you had such confidence in e-levy, should you be that quick to? I was personally surprised when I don't want to use names, but we all saw the news, in the form of a rumor start filtering in about going to the IMF, and then it came as a reality. But the thing is, 6 months, if we have such confidence in e-levy, with all the things that were said about it, shouldn't we give it a little more time before we throw our hands in the air and say, hey, because they said e-levy was really the thing.
Right. But you see, the other thing though is that it may not be too early to start looking for what I call the early warning signals, right? So ideally, the projection was that Parliament was going to pass the budget, pass the e-levy, and therefore in January, e-levy was going to roll, and therefore by the end of 2022, you would have raised the 7 billion in e-levy. And mind you, this even included, at least from statements that I heard from some government representatives, the 7 billion they were projecting even included their estimation that there will be a drop in the number of people who decide to use Momo for various kinds of financial transactions. But I think that if you look at how long it took for it to get through Parliament, right, and you also look at the fact that in the first month or two of it, how you grossly understated how much you were going to be able to raise. I think you don't have the luxury of time to say, let me wait another 2-3 months to see what is going to happen, especially because the early signs don't look too good. Now, maybe things may change, they may not change. But I think the dilemma you face is, do I bite the bullet now and get help, or do I wait much longer? The disease could get worse if you wait longer.
Clearly stated. But wouldn't you agree, Doc, as somebody who's been observing this economy from a distance for forever, I should say, really, you know, at least as far as this government's lifespan is concerned, wouldn't you say that the signals were there much earlier, even pre-e-levy, the e-levy brouhaha?
Right. And you see, so, I mean, if you start, especially around 2019, you start seeing some of the signals that says the trajectory may present some problems for us, right? And then you enter into 2020, and then there's COVID. Now, I don't blame everything on COVID. I mean, COVID was a global phenomenon. We all knew how COVID shook various countries, was the e-levy. But I think they underestimated the extent of the opposition they were going to face, not just in Parliament, but also in terms of the feedback that was going to come from citizens and how citizens were going to react in terms of, okay, if this thing goes through, I'm going to change my behavior around
how
I think that was grossly underestimated, which is why the e-levy that they believe would have solved the revenue issues and challenges didn't do that, and now you have to get to it. The other point I will add quickly though is that, but even with e-levy, even if we stick with fiscal year 2022, even with e-levy, we were still left with a budget deficit of 37 billion, right? Which means that the government still had to find ways of meeting that 37 billion budget deficit. I mean, without e-levy, then it was going to be about 44 billion. So you're right, the signals were there. But I think, I'm guessing that in the estimation of the finance minister, the economic management team in this government, they somehow believe that other measures could work as opposed to turning to the IMF, and one of it was the e-levy. And now that it's not turning out that way, then we have to look for another alternative, and that alternative has become going to the IMF for a bailout.
I personally, I'm not too convinced about that e-levy thing, but I'll leave that for now. No, let's look at this. Let's look at this again. The IMF coming in like that would mean significant lifestyle, implications for our people, for the Ghanaian, the average Ghanaian. What are some of these likely to be?
It's from what I understand, sometimes as part of the negotiations, right, the first step is not even the IMF, quote unquote, imposing conditionalities. It actually starts with the government seeking bailout, saying, okay, we've examined that situation, we see where the lapses are, we are asking that you give us X amount of money. And we are promising that in exchange for that, we will do X, Y, and Z. So it's up to the government seeking the help to actually start the negotiation with what they are offering. Then as part of the negotiations, the IMF can say, okay, you said you're going to do 10 things. Well, those 10 things are acceptable, but from what we've observed, maybe you need to do one more thing. And it could mean anything, especially if you look at the situation that we are facing. Our situation is really a revenue situation, right? Not being able to raise enough revenue to meet our expenditure obligations. Senior, even if you look at the projections of the budget that was presented all the way through 2025, we're still going to face a budget deficit of 31 billion next year, 27 billion in 2024, and 29 billion in 2025. And this is even including what the government projected that they would get from e-levy, which means that if you cannot raise enough revenue, then you will have to be ready to do something about your expenditure.
Doc.
And that's where the biggest headache comes in. What are you going to cut from your budget?
Exactly, and that's my question. Now, my next question, because not too long ago, we saw the government rally its think tank, so to speak, together, right, to figure out what they were going to do. Ken Oforiatta came out to give us a list of things they were going to do. They were going to cut a certain percentage from their salaries and whatnot, you know, all of that. What else are they going to do? Because they just, not too long ago, did something that in their outlook should be the solution. What else do you project they are going to do?
So, in every budget, you spend money on two main categories. What I call mandatory spending. That one, you have no choice but to spend money on it, which is wages and salaries, you know, of those on the public wage bill, and then interest payments on money that you borrowed. That's one. And then two, discretionary spending. Those are things that you don't have to spend money on, but as a government, you have decided these are good things to spend money on for the citizens of my country.
Yeah.
Even if, so last year I looked at the budget and on things that I consider as discretionary spending, free SHS, 1D1, planting for food and jobs, etc., etc. Those even come up to, I don't think they came up to more than 10 billion, right? So let's say you decide nursing training allowances, teacher training allowances. Let's say you decide that you're going to put a freeze on all discretionary spending. That's just 10 billion, meaning you need another 27 billion. But senior, where are you going to cut? Are you willing now to say that you're going to cut the public wage bill, which actually means you're going to lay people off, right? Or are you going to stop paying your debts? Or are you going to try and renegotiate for lower payments? Because you know that for every 100 cedis that we raise in revenue, almost about 70 cedis of that goes into paying, meeting our public wage bill as well as paying our debt. You remember years ago, I think we were in secondary school then, there was we had things like redundancy, retrenchment, things like that. Yes, those were part of economic recovery program reforms supported by both the IMF and the World Bank, which included reducing the public wage bill. But that would also be very, imagine in these times that we are, right, challenging times, and one of the things that you have to cut is, because you can't cut anymore, you have to tend to things like cutting the public wage bill. I mean, are you going to send people? Are you going to send people home? Yes, you did. I mean, the last time, one of the things that was done is a freeze on public sector employment. But we're still facing this huge public wage bill. But you see, if we are to get out of this cycle of every number of years we go back to the IMF, we'll have to make some very difficult choices, right? We may have to make some painful cuts, but we will also have to make some difficult impositions on tax raising or on revenue raising mechanisms, plug the holes, collect as much as we can, improve revenue collection efficiency, but we would have to cut out, the things that are mandatory, even if we don't want to touch the public wage bill now, at least can we cut out a lot of the expenditure that we spend on public officials and see how much of that can help? Can we look at various social intervention programs by government,
especially the ones that are not working?
We can restructure them. So, for example, free SHS.
Exactly.
Right? A couple of months ago, there was when free SHS was back in the debate, IEA had a proposal that said, well, maybe we can do some cost sharing. Maybe government takes a portion of it, and then parents and guardians also take another portion of it. I mean, are there ways that we can restructure some of these social intervention programs that reduces the financial burden on government? Because we can't keep spending more than we bring in unless we are willing to keep borrowing. Because your 37 billion budget deficit, right? How are you going to make up for it unless you're willing to borrow all that 37 billion, which also has other dangerous implications for a country's economy.
Exactly. So Doc, the obvious, the big elephant in the room. According to the Auditor General in the 2020 report, that's what I have available, so I'm just going to use that. But in the 2020 report, the Auditor General reported that, and let me make sure I'm getting the figure right. The Auditor General reported that 2,500,176,409 Ghana cedis. With this going on, is the IMF likely, do they have the capacity to point to the obvious and say, hey, listen, there's a huge, gap that we've seen, a huge plug that if failed will definitely change the circumstance. Do they ever do some things like that? Do they point to the obvious in the room?
Yes, and normally one of the things that they usually point out to countries that are seeking bailouts from them is fiscal management, but more especially the discipline that comes with managing your money. Because like you said, if you look at the Auditor General's report, right, and you see the amount of leakages through various kinds of financial irregularities, can you imagine a scenario where we are able to plug in all of those holes, right? Think about a situation where next year we are able to plug all of these holes, and the auditor comes out next year with his report, and there's not even more than, let's say, $100,000 in revenue leakages. We are talking a couple of millions of dollars that several millions of dollars that you saved. So for me, at this point, we should be willing to put a lot on the table, right? To be able to say, no bets are up. Let's look deeply at our situation. What kinds of commitments can we make? Yes, in the short term, it's going to be painful, but in the long term, it saves not just the next 2-3 years, but we need to find a way to end this cycle. But Senior, the other thing that we cannot also forget is that, as the old adage goes, all economic decisions are ultimately political decisions, which means that you also have an election in 2 years. So I'm sure you have to balance the painful choices today with the policy that I lose the 2024 election. That's fine, because my country will be better off in the long term. I don't know too many politicians across the world who are willing to take that gamble and say, I'll do this and whatever happens, even if it means I lose the election.
Some governments.
So that's also the other reality that the government faces, the political implications of the choices they make with this IMF program.
Doc, I was just saying that some governments actually do, take the hard decisions in their second term, but in this government, which is vehemently seeking to break the eight, your fear is well founded. Okay, so former President Mahama was in the news recently with what I see as practical suggestions. I'm not the one to say whether they will work or not, but at least he didn't just criticize and leave. He left something on the table. One of the things he said is that the finance minister, Ken Ofori-Atta, should be fired. Do you think this will do anything to shift the pin at all?
It may, right? And I'm saying it may because I think sometimes when we've been in a situation and a particular model is the model that is being followed, and we are seeing that it's producing some major challenges, sometimes you need a set of fresh eyes, right? You need a new perspective, a different perspective. So maybe if you were to do some reshuffling and put in someone different, they may be able to bring a new perspective to bear, and who knows, may be able to shift or change the direction a little bit. I personally think that, even for, uh, I think that every so often it's important to step back and take stock of how things are going. And depending on how things are going, you should be willing to make some changes and some moves around. Moves even meaning moving people around. So it could bear some fruit, like I said. Perhaps it could bring a different perspective, a different fresh of eyes to look at our situation and help say, look, let's try and move in a different direction. I mean, the Honorable Ken Ofori-Atta has been in for 6 years. I mean, he's done what he can done. I don't think that it would undo this government if they decide that can we freshen up the team a little bit. I don't think it would do them any harm.
Look, I know you speak your mind freely without fear and without bias. If, however, you were sent out to make a case for this government, for Ghanaians to understand the need to go to the IMF, against the backdrop of them having bashed the idea so badly, what would be the best message you could put out there?
I think I'll start off by saying, yes, I understand that I said all of these things about IMF back in 2014, 2015. I realized that sometimes when you get into government, the reality that you face, the choices that you make, do come with different kinds of consequences that in hindsight, you're realizing that some of these tools are proper tools to turn to in times of difficulty and in times of crisis. Then the other thing that I would make a case for would say, but look, I would just pretty much find a very simple way of pointing out all of these numbers and what it means for the day-to-day consequences of the things that government can or cannot do given this dire situation, and say, give us that, that is the case that I would make. Acknowledge that your past statements were not the best statements, although it gave you some political muscle and political gain. Acknowledge the reality that we face. Admit that some choices, don't blame all of it on external circumstances. I would say, yes, we face some global challenges, but we've also made some policy choices that has presented us with these challenges. But we realize that if you look at all the challenges we're facing, if we don't do this, the situation could even deteriorate further. And therefore, this is the reason why we are turning to the IMF to try and do this bailout. And let the citizens decide. The last thing I will do is I won't keep making references to what a previous government did or did not do or failed to do. Because I think it gets to a point where what citizens are looking for is not so much what you think of your predecessor, but I think what they're looking for is the present. Because now you own it. You are the one in power, and therefore they're looking to you to fix the problems and not the person that they voted out of power.
So, Doc, what's the place of the opposition in all of this, though? Is this the time for the opposition does this give the opposition any leverage to say, hey, let's look at these things that we already presented to you, i.e. the cost of the president's travels, for instance, remunerations, for government officials, spending on the presidency, things like that. Does this give the opposition any clout, or the government can still just take any decision they want?
Honestly, especially because of the composition of parliament, right? We're talking a 138, 137 parliament, right? With even some one or two, a couple of absenteeism here and there. So for me, I think this will also be the time to I know we always say this. We have to find ways to work together. We have to forge some bipartisan compromises, things like that. But I think it gives hopefully it also gives the opposition a little bit of clout to be able to also get some of their points across in anything that, whatever is negotiated, if it needs parliamentary approval, to be able to get their parliamentary approval, right? I just hope that the government will be willing to make certain concessions. Of course, it would involve difficult conversations, hard bargains. I'm sure there are some particular things that the opposition, if they had a say, would want to ensure that it's all part of the program that we present.
I can give you an example of one such, because they made a point of it in the just ended demonstration that they made, and that was their Sami Jemfi, one of their leaders,
Yes.
mentioned it expressly that they wanted e-levy, for instance, scrapped. If the government is tacitly admitting that e-levy is not working, should they push hard, for instance, to scrap e-levy?
So you have, I mean, if you look at when e-levy was first mentioned, right, you could see the determination in the finance minister to really get this e-levy through parliament. But you could also see the determination of the opposition and the concerns they raised to make sure that e-levy doesn't pass, right? So both of them are two poles apart. Maybe is there a middle ground that says instead of 1.5, maybe e-levy is 0.5 or 0.6? Or if we scrap e-levy, right, which means there's loss of revenue, how do we make up, what's the other thing that we came to? But this would involve some very, very difficult conversations, long, difficult conversations.
Absolutely.
But I think at some point we would have to find a way to find a compromise.
I hope I'm able to speak
on the issues that find this particular issue of the IMF bailout, e-levy in particular.
Yeah. I hope I'm able to squeeze in my last few questions. But one of them is this. Doc, what should the body language of the government be? For instance, we are running to the IMF at a point where just last week it was reported that the government, the president I should say, still hired a private jet for a ridiculous amount of money. We are looking at government expenditure. We look at how much money is devoted to the presidency versus how much the wages of the working class, for instance, was upped. What should be the body language of the government in all of this?
I think the body language should be very, very different, right? I mean, politics, governing, right? There's, it's both an art and a science. The science part of governing a country is the hard choices, the policies, the programs that you pursue. But the art part of governing a country, like you said, is the posture, is the body language, the facial expressions, the things that you do in your public interactions or appearances with citizens that gives them this assurance that, oh, okay, at least you do recognize that you've made some choices that have led us into some difficult situations. You recognize them and you're willing to change your behavior. I think people are, at least from some of the comments and sentiments that you read and hear, I think people want to see that, right? People want to see a change in behavior publicly, right? So like you said, some of the choices that we've been making, and then, vis-a-vis, because during the e-levy debate, a lot of the comments you read is, oh, you want me to pay e-levy so you can use for X, Y, and Z,
exactly.
right? What citizens were seeing as certain luxuries.
Yes.
So if you can change some of that public posture and some of that public behavior, hopefully you can restore a certain amount of the lost trust and confidence, so that when you start asking people to make hard choices, they would at least be able to say, oh, okay, well, you are making some changes as well. Therefore, we can see
we can tighten our belts along
the
with
changes
you.
that we can also make.
Okay, and Doc, one thing that one narrative that I hear going around a lot is that we've been to the IMF 16 times. If it worked, we wouldn't have had to go 16 times. Would we? Will it work? Is this even
Yeah.
necessary?
Yeah, but you also have to ask yourself, whenever it started working, did we change our behavior, or did we go got headache and we got all that relief from headache, and we got a lot of our, some of the debt cancelled, etc., etc. Not even just in Ghana, but if you look at other countries that went through headache, once they reached the decision point and got the debt relief, a year later, you start seeing that their borrowing habits changed again, which meant they started borrowing again. Even in Ghana, right, you would see our debt trajectory starting to change after headache. So, yes, we've gone 16 times, and this is the 17th time. It works if, after getting better, you stop doing the things that make you sick. Otherwise, if you don't change your choices and your behavior, trust me, in another 4 or 5 years, we will get quote unquote sick again, and we will have to go back and see the doctor.
Doc, thank you so much for making time with us today. You speak
You're
Tree,
welcome,
right, Doc?
anytime.
You speak some Tree.
Yes, a little.
I'm
yes.
going to push you to the wall. I need you to speak some Tree for me today. We're going to the markets in Makola and Mamobi and KJTR and Kotokraba and everywhere. I'm putting you before the women and the men in the markets who don't really understand the, the minutiae of, the details of going to the IMF, etc. Tell them in the little tree that you can master, Doc. Are we going to be okay? Hello? Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know if Doc ran away or if we actually have a genuine, break in the communication. But thank you so much, Dr. John Osae Kwapong, for making time with us today. And thank you for making the issues very simple for us to understand. We'll be right back with the rest of the show. Welcome back. Okay, now the interview with the big doctor is done. Let me release my tie a little bit so I can speak a little more freely. Okay, in 2016, I had the singular honor of interviewing Dr. Mahamudu Bawumia, who was then the candidate, the MPP opposition candidate for opposition vice president candidate, at the time. We spoke about a variety of things, but at that time, at that specific time, John Dramani Mohammed's government had decided to go to the IMF for a bailout. Now, full disclosure, I was personally livid at that decision. I had been following John Mohammed's government for a while. I had been impressed with some of the things they were doing, and then came the decision to go to the IMF. I did not necessarily feel like going to the IMF was a bad thing, but I was looking at it against the backdrop that we had just struck oil not too long ago. So where was all the money going? It gave me a very sour taste in my mouth about the whole excitement surrounding finding oil. If we had to go to the IMF only years after striking oil, then what's the point? Was my thing at the time. But John Mahama is not the subject here, actually. Dr. Mahamudu Bawumia, Dr. Mahamudu Bawumia is. He had a lot of things to say about the way the government was handling affairs at the time. Strikingly, when I sit down to listen to that interview today, a lot of the things he stated are repeating themselves today. Do you feel vindicated? Because you did warn them. I mean, you were in the news saying that this path is going to end up on the doorstep of the IMF.
Yes.
And just a couple of weeks ago, we have indeed gone for an IMF bailout.
Yes.
How do you feel? You feel vindicated?
Not really. I feel sad. The whole, when you watch, as I said, a train wreck coming and you're telling the driver, hey, it's going to happen, don't go this fast or whatever, and they ignore you, and you are part of the train. We are all Ghanaians. If it's good for all of us. If it's bad for all of us. So there's no, sense that, oh, yes, I told you so. I think that I rather feel sad because it was completely avoidable if we had done the right things and heeded to good advice from our own people.
Dr. Bawumia felt that, and to be honest, he did not necessarily think that going to the IMF was necessarily a bad thing. He stated expressly that his problem was with the government who had brought us to the point where we had to go to the IMF. Back to the IMF bailout before we round up, just quickly before we round up. Is it necessarily negative? Is the deal necessarily negative?
No. We are not saying that it is necessarily negative. And as I said before, some of the things that we're saying that the government should do, which the IMF has said the same things, the government is now going to be made to do. In fact, I would have worried very much if the government had continued on that path that it was embarked on without the intervention of the IMF, because it would have hurt the country even more. The IMF is going to come in and put in measures and monitor and make sure that, everything is reported accurately, and they will monitor to make sure that, what needs to be done will be done. The IMF will give us breathing room, and it will help us restore macroeconomic stability. But whether we are able to use that breathing room properly and to grow this economy, the IMF's remit is very narrow. The IMF will not show you how to deal with your energy crisis. It will not tell you to go and sign a 10-year deal to deal with a 2-year problem, as we have done with Turkey. The IMF will not tell you that you need financial inclusion. Make sure your people have bank accounts. That's not their remit. They will not tell you that you need to move from cash payments to electronic payments to grow your economy. They will not tell you to reduce taxes. Those are things that you need to figure out. They'll say have fiscal discipline, but you have to have fiscal discipline.
And what has your government done, Dr. Bawumia? So we're following your footsteps now. We're not mad at going to the IMF, but we are mad at the fact that your government, after 6 years in government, after getting 3 times the revenue that you mentioned on oil, about all the borrowing that you were concerned about, the previous government borrowing, which you have done more, upon all the money that came in from other sources. The good doctor mentioned COVID as one of the things that distracted, the progress of the economy. Truth be told, it's not necessarily the case for this government, because the government had a heavy buffer from the international community to deal with the COVID. What happened with the money? Is the IMF going to seek accountability, for instance, before they inject any more money into the economy? I don't know, but I hope so. Because personally, I think that the biggest reason why we're here today is because of government corruption and not accountability for the resources. If we had a government that held a stick over its appointees and made sure that they were doing what they were supposed to do, a huge part of this problem would be solved. And perhaps we would not even have to go to the IMF after all. But the reality is here, we are going to the IMF. And Dr. Bawumia, if you knew all this, then you could have saved us the trouble of going to the IMF. You could have. And just before I go, let me mention, I don't see you, Dr. Baumia, in any of the meetings concerning the economy these days. Recently, we heard that a crack team of people were going to meet to think about how to push the economy forward. We had that great minister of all people. I don't know what that guy was going to do over there. He hasn't said anything of substance that I have heard. If you've heard anything of substance that that guy has said, show me. And I'll give you an example of what he has said. I did a show on him with the GMO thing. What he said was short of stupid.
So we are eating genetically modified food.
Already.
Of course.
Already.
So has anybody died, or you know whether there is any intensity of these cancers and all these weird diseases that they are talking about in Ghana and other West Africa, other places, or even in America itself, because they eat that the same poultry.
So I don't know why he would be in a team that's supposed to rescue Ghana from anything. And you, doctor, the whiskey was not in there. What's going on? Anyway, time's run out. I'm out of here. Thank you for watching. My name is Kwesi son Baako. I come in peace, but I come not to please. This is MixMixx. I'll see you next week. Have a good time. Goodbye.